Variation in seriousness. Are you by chance going to be here? I didn't know about that.
No, just he's coming.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So
I am going to be here.
Yeah, join us at 1. If you want to.
Sure, no, I can.
Friday,
Definitely. Well, I have lunch on Friday. I'm here again.
Really?
Yeah.
Two assistant superintendents were suspended allegedly in the Badagry area of Lagos.
We did several years ago. I think it was we did an Angola conference, major sort of all day long. And they spoke at that. I get them all the time too. I do not do them. Sometimes very sympathetic to the person. I really don't know. There's this Angola Chamber of Commerce group headed by what's her name? Jean used to be at Africa for a number of years.
In Washington?
Yeah, in Washington. Who I sometimes refer to Angola things to. I can give you the contact on that.
Okay.
I don't think the last name right now, but she's good. She's got Africa for a number of years.
You know, they're always interns or students. In Boston, I used to do a lot of Asian stuff. It's so disappointing because most of these people are economic developers.
Yeah.
And very few of them are persecution. And yet, Boston is
I know exactly what that's all. I have inundated with this for all these years. I just had to myself have a personal policy. I do it. People always understood it. I always understood it. Helpful.
How did the elections go? I haven't heard a word about it.
They haven't heard you. They haven't talked.
No, they haven't.
No, they're starting in May. There's the sort of typical local elections, then presidential and parliamentary, stretch around the church. Manchester trade. Let's go. That's in
Mine is easy. You either get it right or wrong in the first time.
Common South African.
Yeah.
Hey, how are you doing? Good to see you.
Somebody's probably all China.
No,
No
Chris
doubt.
actually came
Okay.
from Minnesota.
These ones?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yeah, but
Well,
look,
good.
it's wearing out.
Good morning. Welcome, everybody, to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm here on behalf of Dr. Monde Muyangwa, the director of our Africa program, who is at another conference today. I would like to say this doesn't happen in our world, but it does, which is actually a good thing. She is much in demand for many things. So happy to be filling in for her today. I'm the executive vice president of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Andrew Seeley, and we're in the capable hands of Jan Kaliski, who you'll hear from in a moment, who has put this panel together today with Monde. Let me recognize Steve McDonald. Great to see Steve here. A senior scholar, or a global fellow, I guess, of the Wilson Center, as well as the former director of the Africa program. Great to see you up and about and looking hale and hearty. Good to have you here, as well as Robert Rotberg. Good to have you here, a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I'm sure there are others I should recognize, so I apologize if I'm overlooking folks here, but glad to have all of you here. Today we're going to be talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, energy security and growth. This is the fifth in a series of meetings that we've been doing, largely based on Jan's work with David Goldwyn over in the other side here, in a book that they've done, which I highly recommend to you, called Energy and Security Strategies for a World in Transition. This thin volume looks at it is not a thin volume, as you can tell, but it is a highly comprehensive treatment of global security, of energy security issues around the world. It is truly global in scope. And so what we've been trying to do every couple of months is look at specific challenges around the world. We've already looked at Asia, we've looked at North America, we've looked at Russia and Eurasia. We had a special presentation by U.S. Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz with a few other people who did sort of global outlook in January. And now we have the fortune to talk about Sub-Saharan Africa today. And obviously this is one of the regions where there is the greatest development of oil reserves in recent years. That's almost doubled, proven reserves almost doubled in the past 30 years. And with that come, enormous opportunities, but also enormous challenges in governance and the relationship between communities and natural resources. So without further ado, welcome to the Wilson Center. Good to have you here. And let me turn this over to Jan Kaliski, who is, by the way, I should say, a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center. Very fortunate to have him leading our energy work, as well as doing a great deal of writing on his own on these issues, continuing the great tradition of this book he did with David.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for that great welcome on behalf of the Wilson Center and the Africa program, and thanks to Liz Ramey and Grace Chesson, who have done a great job pulling together the preparations for the panel. As Andrew indicated, this is the fifth bi-monthly session. And we've had a great experience going through each of the regions of the world, and we look forward very much to our sub-Saharan discussion today. And in fact, prior to this discussion, we had just in January the 2015 Global Energy Policy Outlook, which was keynoted, as Andrew indicated, by Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz. So it's been a very good tour d'horizon, if you will, of the global energy landscape. The substantive framework for the series is provided by the book that Andrew referred to, which is second edition of our book. The first edition said we needed to have an American energy policy, and the second edition says we have to tackle the global landscape as well. So this is what we've produced. It's now in its second printing by the Wilson Center Press and the Johns Hopkins University Press. Co-edited with my good friend and colleague David Goldwyn. Also two of our panelists, Phil Van Niekerk and Charles McPherson, joined us in contributing book chapters. on Sub-Saharan Africa and on energy governance, transparency, and sustainable development. And in fact, Philip came back just last night from Nigeria and is looking amazingly lively after that such a long trip. And only a bit earlier, Charles came back from Ghana, so we'll hear firsthand from the continent, if you will, from two of our colleagues. Let me just say a few words before I introduce our panelists on the energy policy framework of our book. One big theme is the need for a national energy policy. Here we're making some progress. For example, the quadrennial energy review of the administration and the new Energy and Natural Resources Bureau at State, which David had so much in preparing the way for a bureau that is very active and playing a very positive role. But still there's some ways to go with multiple agencies that are involved in energy issues in the government, and no less than 5 White House offices, and each of these have their own point of view, so some degree of integration is required, not to mention the labyrinth on Capitol Hill. A second big theme is the fundamental changes that are underway in the global energy landscape, and obviously in the low oil price environment, which we'll be hearing about, this creates definite challenges from the point of view of the producers, and hopefully some degree of stimulus from the point of view of the consumers. In addition to that, we find that U.S. production is reaching new highs, and the global production axis, if you will, is moving from east to west. The driver of energy consumption has moved to the east, particularly China and India, with important implications for African supplies. Traditional consumers are becoming producers, traditional producers are becoming consumers, and we need to update our international energy architecture to take that into account, as opposed to the traditional collections of producers in OPEC and consumers in the International Energy Agency. Now it's much more of an overlapping universe. And for that reason, we advocate a new eclectic approach, which we call a Global Energy Security System, or GES. To our mind, GES has at least 6 main components. First, to promote the unconventional energy revolution, not only here domestically, but also abroad. Second, to create a competitive global gas market. Third, to forge greater coordination of emergency response measures. Fourth, lead a multilateral effort to end energy poverty, characterized by still over 1.3 billion people not having access to electricity in the world. Fifth, to integrate energy and environmental strategies. And sixth, to engage globally and protect sea lanes for energy transportation. So without further ado, I am going to move to introducing our panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. Speaking to oil and gas developments in the region will be Philip van Niekerk, who is Managing Director of Calabar Consulting and former editor of South Africa's Mail and Guardian newspaper. On the challenge of electric power and also renewables, Michelle Rivard is with us. She is Chief of Staff of the U.S. African Development Foundation, which is a key agency in the U.S. government's Power Africa initiative. On energy governance and transparency, and with some reference to international financial institutions, Charles McPherson is an international advisor on petroleum and minerals policies and taxation, and former senior advisor at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And then concluding will be on the impact of low oil prices on project development, the need for a new sustainable model. My co-editor, David Goldwyn, who is president of Goldwyn Global Strategies and former special envoy and international energy coordinator under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. So without further ado, let me ask Philip to get the ball rolling.
Okay. I think we were here about a year ago talking about, well, at that point, the narrative of the story was the sort of coming hydrocarbons boom in Africa. Africa, which for a long time had been confined to a couple of major producers like Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and a couple of major companies, about 5 of them, suddenly was opening up all over the place, new discoveries, new producers, exploration being pushed out to the frontiers, even as far as places like Somalia, Western Sahara, Mauritania. And the whole sort of impact of what was sort of coming down, what Africa was potentially facing, was very major, because even if Africa's contribution to the overall global sort of oil and gas production, even after it's reached many of its opportunities, it's still going to be relatively small. For Africa, it's a big deal. This would be the largest source of investment, both in terms of the infrastructure that happens and in terms of the the revenue that's going to come from the oil and gas. And we all know the sort of challenges of the resource curse. So a year ago, we were sitting here talking about the governance challenges. How's Africa going to meet this? How are they going to ensure that this bounty is going to be translated into real benefits for the people of Africa? Now, the story now obviously has changed somewhat. In the last 6 months to a year, we've seen the price come down quite substantially. And this has obviously had a major effect on how one views the current prospects in Africa. And it's particularly cruel to a lot of the African countries who were sort of thinking that they might, in a relatively short space of time, become major or become oil and gas producers who hadn't had that before, because this has certainly sort of changed the equation more than somewhat. And I think if you look down the sort of list of what, who are the losers and who are the winners, a lot of the exploration for crude oil in offshore Africa, projects are being put on hold. Exploration offshore South Africa, nothing's happening. The more technologically challenging and expensive exploration in the Sub-Saharan, much of West Africa is also being put on hold, outside of Angola and Nigeria and Ghana, I suppose. So countries like Liberia, Mauritania, even Sierra Leone, there's a slowdown, definite slowdown in the projects there. Now, onshore exploration is significantly cheaper. One of the advantages of what's been going on is that the rigs are much cheaper, and also technological changes have meant a massive sort of like diminution of costs. So you've got a company like Tullow, which is a real bellwether for the continent. Tullow Oil, which because it operates, and I mean it's the main operator in Ghana, and it operates in something like 14 or 15 countries in Africa. They've basically suspended all of their offshore exploration and are concentrating, for instance, on 6 major onshore production exploration in the basins in Kenya. I think the rig count, it's not substantially down. I think the Baker Hughes does an annual monthly rig count. It's down from about 140 to 132, but I think that figure is going to continue to go down. I think probably a better way of measuring the impact can be on the companies, the listed companies that operate in the African oil space. Tullow Oil's down year on year more than 57%. Ophir Energy is down more than 60%. Afren, which has other problems, is down more than 95% in the year. And I think it's not just the price that's basically determining this, it's also the geology. Some countries have all the luck where there are world-class assets, as in Nigeria, Angola, and offshore Mozambique and Tanzania, that the interest is still going to be there, and it's still going to continue to attract, major investment, as we're going to see. Ghana, of course, as well. There's the only significant new West African discovery over the last decade or so, incidentally, in the Tano Basin. What it does mean, of course, is the balance of power is back in the hands of the producers. But I also think it's a very important sort of wake-up call to a lot of African countries who were looking at this bonanza as being, suddenly these pots of money we're going to descend, and this is going to be, some kind of great move forward. What it does is it focuses the mind. I mean, the only way Africa is going to continue on the path of growth and development is through investment in the real economy. I mean, there's 2 sides to the oil price collapse. There's certainly it's bad on the extractive sector and it's bad on the producers. But for the consuming countries, it's pretty good. It's a bit of a stimulus. I think it adds something like 1 or 2% growth to consumption, to the GDP of those countries that are purely consumers. So it forces countries to focus on finding ways to support the consumer sector, the manufacturing sector, those areas of the economy outside of the extractive sector. Extractive sector, it's all very good and it's all very well. At some point, the price is going to recover. At some point, we're going to achieve some of those benefits. But don't rely on that, because that's actually the resource curse, is a sense of relying on massive revenue to fall down from heaven and deliver you. And that's not going to happen. And I think if anything, this reality check has been positive in that sense. I think that Angola is the horror story of a country that is almost entirely sort of dependent upon a commodity. It's very much a sort of a mono economy based on oil, 45% of GDP. And they've come down, I think Angola was probably one of the 2 or 3 fastest growing economies in the world in 2012. They've come down from 12%. They're going to be lucky to do 3% this year. Story in Nigeria is somewhat a little bit different, because while this is obviously has a huge impact on government revenues, Nigeria is actually moved by the real economy. Oil is and has actually managed to diversify to the extent that oil, I think, is only 14% of Nigerian GDP. So Nigeria will come down this year from, say, 7% last year to just about 5% under current predictions. It's not completely, though the banks are very leveraged into the oil sector. The new sort of emerging indigenous companies, and I think I'll talk a little bit about them if I have time, have also been quite hard hit by that. Now, the other big effect this is having is on Tanzania and Mozambique, where we've had these world-class discoveries in the last 5 years to a decade of so some of the biggest discoveries in the world. And you have these massive liquefied natural gas projects being planned by Eni and Anadarko, cost upwards of $23 billion. Originally, we were going to see the first LNG in 2019. I think some of the final investment decision has been delayed by some 6 months. And obviously, there's some niggling doubts about the viability of these projects based on the fact that the main market for the LNG has been East Asia, Japan, Korea, China, India. Demand in China has slowed significantly, but the long-term price of LNG is indexed on the oil price. So while in America, the natural gas price is in many ways detached from the oil price, natural gas has been zooming along at its own level and hasn't really suffered or really went down some years back. If you're looking at the sort of long term, the price of LNG has come down quite substantially. For the moment, there's a surge of demand in Europe, which kind of makes up for it a little bit, and sort of Eni must be, and with Europe sort of wanting to, in a way, free itself from the clutches of dependence on Russian gas, Mozambique becomes quite important, and it's important that Eni is the Italians are going to be the main producers there, and they might I think they see it to some extent as a strategic project as well. So I don't see these projects being cancelled. The resources are too good, but there's something of a niggling doubt. I mean, if the price continues to sort of go down, and I think we're seeing some estimates that oil will be at $30, $35 by the end of the year, that's very possible, then certainly projects like the Mozambican LNG, which are going to have huge impact on the East African economies, will be potentially put in doubt. Now, Nigeria, I just want to talk a little bit about the indigenous producers, because I think one of the biggest structural changes to the African economy is the emergence of small to medium-sized Nigerian companies who are themselves operators and producers, and who are accumulating capital and in fact going out to the rest of the continent. And as the continent sort of moves up in terms of oil production, the Nigerians in many ways are bigger players, let's say, than the Chinese, who we've always been kind of worried about. Now, we can come back to that if you like. The indigenous sector, unfortunately, they've acquired a lot of resources from Shell, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, from the big majors who are moving offshore. They're not moving out, they're moving offshore. In fact, Shell just made an announcement in February that they're going to go ahead with one of the biggest deepwater blocks. The Bonga Southwest is going to be 250,000 barrels a day. It's an $18, $20 billion project. Also, there's huge. Also, Eni's going ahead with OPL 245. So the majors are still in Nigeria, but they've gone offshore, and the onshore stuff is being left to the indigenous companies. The problem with that is that for the indigenous companies, they bought a lot of those assets when the valuations were indexed to oil at $70 to $100 a barrel. So they've not only lost massively in terms of their valuations, but they've also got huge mountains of debt that they've got to pay off. And that's kind of hampered the sector, so you're probably going to see a lot of mergers and changes. Now, it's very uneven and it's complicated, but a company like Afrin, for instance, which was one of the biggest of the Nigerian producers and also exploring in 11 other African countries, is literally dead in the water and very open for takeover or for anybody who wants to come and cherry pick their assets, because they just got too much into exploration and got too much debt. Company like Owanda also got very big debt. They got ConocoPhillips' assets in Nigeria, but they actually managed to hedge the sales of their crude forward at $95 a barrel. So they did something very clever. So they're actually in not a bad position. And Seplat, which is just listed in the London Stock Exchange, actually failed to purchase any of the Shell assets in the last round, which was lucky for them, because now they're sitting with a war chest of cash to go and buy assets at a point when the assets are very, very cheap. Can I make one more point?
By all means.
I want to come back to this, because I think this is very significant, the Nigerian thing and the offshore. But I also want to make a point about conflict, which is that if you were to fly over Africa right now and say, well, where are the worst areas of conflict on the continent, you'd say, well, Libya. I know we're not supposed to be talking really Sub-Saharan, but Libya's there. South Sudan and Nigeria. And what's the common denominator in all of those cases is that they're all major oil producers. Now, I'm not saying that oil is the driver of the conflict, but oil is certainly a complicating factor. And when you see, and what's interesting about all of those conflicts is they're not state conflicts. There's conflicts within society. And that makes it all the more important. And when we look at the new oil and gas regimes, and we're already seeing tensions in Mozambique, tensions in Tanzania, tensions in Kenya, up on Lake Turkana. The lesson also from Nigeria is that you've got to construct basically a framework in which the distribution of the revenues from the oil is seen to be fair, in which everybody participates, and which is transparent. It makes it even more so. The potential for this great big bonanza of oil, which will come, even if it comes later than we might have expected, the potential of that to destroy already fragile societies where there are different groups competing for state power makes it absolutely imperative that this is one of the things that we address our minds to. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. Now on the Power Africa side of the ledger, Michelle Rivard.
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Philip, for identifying where the sources of energy are so we can get to power in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in particular, I appreciate your phrase of getting everyone to participate, because that is really what's behind a lot of Power Africa and my agency, the U.S. African Development Foundation. So the question that I'd like us to talk about is how can we increase power for the 600 million people who are without it? And how can we do it both reliably and affordably? So who are these people? We know who they are. They're the ones who can't run their grain processing factories. They can't buy the harvest from the smallholder farmers who are just waiting to sell them. They're the entrepreneurs who can't run their shops or maintain their equipment. And they're also the parents of the kids who can't study at night. Because what do they have? You know, they have a few candles, they have a kerosene lamp. If they're lucky, they have a little bit of diesel left in their generator at the end of the month. Maybe. And we all know this directly feeds in to better livelihoods and a better economy. Kids study for their exams, they get better grades, they get into a better secondary school, they have opportunities. Personally, I don't know what I would do without my extra algebra book and studying with my son at night. I don't know where he would be. But let me give you an example of some of the work that we're doing. In Nigeria, we're working with a solar company called GVE. They're in the Delta. They are lighting up 300 households in a village called Egbeke, pardon me. It's near Port Harcourt, And these Nigerian energy entrepreneurs, an SME, first piloted a 6-kilowatt solar project. It reached a third of the people there. The U.S. African Development Foundation came in, awarded them a $100,000 grant, and now they're going to be able to reach the rest of the community. They're expanding the mini-grid, and for the people who are more far-flung, they've come up with portable battery kits so that their homes and their micro-ventures have power. So that's one example of how Power Africa is working to light up cities and homes and businesses. So who's doing this, you might ask? Well, there are 12 agencies across the U.S. government who are working as one, bringing an array of tools together. We're coordinating our work so that if you have a feasibility study going on for a hydroelectric project, you can couple that and inform an insurance deal. You can do this consecutively, and you can bring together the grant instruments and the debt instruments in a very intentional manner. We have thus far committed $7 billion of government support, but of course with the challenges that my colleagues are talking about and we're all well aware of, U.S. taxpayer dollars, it just isn't enough. But the good thing about Power Africa is it was never intended to. So we are one of those initiatives that's not only using the word leverage, we're actually meaning it. The private sector is critical here, and I'm happy to say that there's a lot of buy-in and actual engagement. Power Africa is an umbrella. We have private sector partners, we have African governments working together. We have over 90 partners who've committed $20 billion, and more are joining this initiative. And they're doing it for large transactions, they're doing it across sectors, across sources of energy. And how else are we expanding? Well, in August at the Africa Leaders Summit, President Obama made the decision to take Power Africa to a whole new level, to help all of Sub-Saharan Africa and get beyond the 6 countries that we started to focus on, including Kenya and Nigeria that you were mentioning. What's our goal? To connect 60 million households and businesses, and to add 30,000 megawatts of new and cleaner generation. Again, how are we going to be doing this? Well, we are intentionally collaborating with some international financial institutions that my colleagues will talk about in their own context. With the World Bank, with the African Development Bank, we are trying to reduce duplication of our efforts so we can make our resources go farther. We also have the AU and NEPAD that are getting involved in Power Africa. Expansion as well means more people. So we're bringing more people on board. But where are they going? I'm happy to say they're not staying here in Washington, D.C. They are going to the continent. The headquarters of Power Africa is overseas, where it needs to be. And when they get there, they're not sitting in the embassy, they're not sitting in a consultant's office, they're actually embedded in these African entities. They're in Ghana's energy ministry. They're in Tanzania that has a strong focus on renewables and the Renewable Energy Agency. They're in public utilities and finance ministries. They're advising on policy. They're helping close deals. They're adding to the local capacity with our African partners and with our private sector partners. And with that, I want to take us to renewables and off of the grid. So USADF is especially concerned with the marginalized and underserved populations who are miles and miles away from the grid. They don't have access to electricity, and it doesn't look like they're going to have access anytime soon. No matter how many resources we're finding, geothermal in Kenya, more natural gas, they're not connecting. So how do we reach them? Fortunately, technology and innovation is a wonderful thing. There are mini-grids, there are microgrids, there are standalone systems. Solar lantern use becomes telephone charging stations, and customers demand more and more. So there's a market there. There's demand there. There there are not just sustainable business models, but there are profits to be made from the bottom billion. And we see a number of African SMEs who are doing that. They're relying on biofuels, wind, water, and sun. And they are not simply companies who know about wind turbines or who have tinkered with, because they're engineers, the latest and greatest solar panels, but they're moving to be service providers. They know how to maintain products, to manage billing and delivery systems, and to provide superior service to their customers. So again, they're testing business models, they're expanding their businesses, they're scaling up solutions, and they're reaching more communities. How am I doing on time?
A couple more minutes.
Okay. ADF is working alongside AID, alongside GE Africa. We have launched a couple competitive challenges and gotten over 500 applications. We have funded 28 companies with over $3 million worth of grant funding and technical assistance. We are estimating we're going to reach 30,000 households and businesses to have, again, reliable, affordable power. Examples, because that really brings it to life for me. So despite my talking about grids and solar, that's not all we're doing. We're also looking for productive uses. So in Kenya, we've got a transportation company, Fufi Power and Light, near Kisumu. What does this have to do with reaching more people? Well, they've created solar charging stations for their motorcycles. Drivers are using their motorcycles to deliver people and products. They're renting them. They're employed. They're running their own small business. And all of this because of a solar energy innovation. In northern Ghana, we have the New Energy Company that is running a social venture. It's using solar power technology to pump and purify the clean drinking water supply. There are 1,000 people near Tamale that are benefiting, and they're the ones who are going to be operating and managing the system. And with the small prices that they're charging, they're going to be making this sustainable and reaching out to other villages nearby. These examples are moving people around easily, providing safe drinking water, being able to communicate with the ubiquitous cell phones, and that's all part of the daily life that we take for granted, but most people don't. I will just close rather than with more examples, but with a picture. Many of us have seen this, the satellite image of Africa by night, and you have specks at the edges and in the big city centers and in the usual suspects of the more wealthy countries. Of course, those specks aren't seeping into the interior very fast, but we can imagine what this satellite map is going to be looking like 5 and 10 years from now.
Thank you very much. And now we will be hearing from Charles McPherson on transparency, governance, and international institutions.
Are these live?
These are live.
These are live. All right.
Yes.
Thank you, Jan. One of those big flares, I remember looking at them. They're the natural gas flares, as you well know. They're stunning, and we need to move them into the country, as you say. Yeah. I'm going to be talking about progress in achieving transparency in resource-rich countries in the resource sectors in Sub-Saharan Africa. And my focus will be on fiscal and financial transparency. Why transparency? Because it really is the cornerstone, one of the cornerstones to good governance. Why the resource sector? Because of all the money that's there. I remember the Angolan finance director Senegal saying to me that it was all about money, Mac, money. And that's where the money is. Why Africa? Because it's resource rich, and as Philip's remarks made very clear. And it's also the title of the talk and this session. And why fiscal and financial? Because that's the fiscal and financial part is really the link to development impact. It's what gets you out of the resource curves. That's about. I'm going to touch on 5 topics, no more than 2 minutes each, all related to the above. One is payment and revenue flows, and I'll talk there about the famous EITI. It's a headline issue that is very important for accountability. Second, licensing procedures and the transparency there. This licensing procedures, the award of contracts and licenses, is a very crucial first link in the petroleum value chain. It's where the rubber starts to hit the road. Third, contract transparency itself. Why contract is it so important? These are public documents. The contracts that they're signed with major oil and gas producers involve a great deal of public money going in and going out, and it's the drive for making them transparent. Fourth, revenue management. What does this mean? What do I mean by it? It means it starts with the design of the fiscal system, goes into revenue collection, so revenue administration, and then importantly into how do you manage the revenues once collected. So you're talking about sovereign wealth funds, but the decisions that are going to be made on savings versus expenditure trade-offs. Very important. It starts to get murky, but it starts to get really critical for avoiding resource cursing and actually delivering on development. The fifth topic, which I'll touch on briefly, is one that is taken up a lot of my attention over the years, and that's on national oil companies. And to me, they represent the black hole. In many cases, they represent the black hole in following the money. Let me say something then about the transparency of revenues and payments made. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this initiative that was established in 2002, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, is about verifying the payments made by the companies and verifying that those payments were received by the countries where they're operating. David has been a practitioner of that, and we've worked together on these sorts of issues. Very important to establish a baseline about how much the country received. It's also important for detecting if there are discrepancies, maybe corruption. But a critical part of it is just saying how much money is there out there on a credited basis. So that's where you start accountability. Once you know what that number is, you can start asking for accountability. How are we doing? Well, there are about 1, 2, 3, 4. There are a good number. Most of the major countries that are producers are involved. Ghana, Mozambique, Cameroon, Congo-Brazzaville, Chad, DRC, Tanzania, and of course Nigeria itself have all signed up to this EITI initiative, and many more are what are called candidate countries. They're working on implementing EITI, but aren't there quite yet. I think one of them is represented in this room, Ethiopia, but also Madagascar, Senegal, Sao Tome, and so on, and Seychelles. So there's a good progress in sign-up, and that's certainly encouraging. I think the disturbing thing for me is that the distinction that is so often made in development economics and the institutions, the kind that I came from, is what's the difference between outputs and outcomes. You've got a lot of, and the EITI administration is well aware of this. A lot of people signed up now, but are the outcomes that you were expecting to deliver with this kind of transparency showing up on the ground? Do people in Nigeria take the transparency numbers about how much money is transferred to Rivers State from the oil coffers, and do they take that number and go to the governor of Rivers State and say, why is there garbage in the road? Why aren't schools operating, and so on? That's the outcome that is important, and that's still a troubling question mark over the EITI and that kind of transparency. On petroleum licensing, I think that there's been quite a good progress there as well, and in different countries in Africa that are both emerging producers and also established producers. Liberia has been licensing, and what we're looking for here is open, transparent bidding procedures in licensing. Not one-on-one company negotiations in some room in a Mayfair hotel, but actually very transparent announcements of inviting people to bid on things, spelling out the procedures that are going to be used, and indicating how the results were justified. Liberia had a recent licensing round. It was marred by some other things, by the fact that they were still in the process of developing legislation, but it was a competitive bid. It did have a model production sharing agreement published at the time of invitation, and it did commit to transparency of the process. Uganda now plans to auction 6 blocks with in their first competitive bid round. Open and transparent is made me very clear. Tanzania is another one. Kenya, Nigeria, and Angola. We can talk about that. Actually, I want to just say two things. You can come back to me on Philip on this. Nigeria has made a great deal of noise about transparency in the way it's going to be conducting its licensing round. But in the 2000s, most of the bid rounds have been marred by a great deal of controversy and legal challenges and so on, and suspicions of malfeasance. Angola, interestingly enough, has been really fully transparent in the licensing itself. There are other problems in that country, but the licensing has been fully transparent, so much so that sitting with one company director there said, well, this wouldn't even happen in Norway when all the results are being published. So interesting results. Africa contracts in Africa. The contracting process, this awarding of licenses and then the assignment of contracts really should be fully open from all the way from tendering to the award of the contracts. And there's a really encouraging array of companies that have now committed to publishing their contracts. They're not all doing it yet, but many of them have. Senegal has committed to it. Mauritania has a large selection of their contracts are available online. Liberia's contracts are available on the Liberia EITI website, and so on. Ghana, the contracts are available on the Ministry of Oil website. So this is good news. Mozambique, which is such an important country, has now started publishing contracts. The focus on the contracts is really important because it reduces corruption risk is one thing. When you know, are the companies paying what they should be paying, people can look into the contract and do the numbers themselves. It does require a great deal of development of the institutional capacity development on the part of those who are reviewing these contracts, but that's one of the important reasons. And the other one, as I said, is that these contracts have such very important implications for both revenue flows in and out of a country. I'll come back to it in the question and answer, for example, but there's some very interesting examples. There's stories to be told. For example, a Uganda story. Uganda doesn't want to publish contracts, but there was a reason that they chose not to, and it's telling. We'll come back to that.
Good teaser.
Teaser. The sovereign wealth funds, or the petroleum revenue management part, I think is a very interesting developing story. I think you're all familiar with sovereign wealth funds when you talk about the Middle East and major countries with enormous wealth. But actually that's starting to catch on in Sub-Saharan Africa as well, and there are about 10 to 12 of them which have been are either operating now or planned. They're not large, but they're going to be important in the future. And they are intricately involved with transparency and good governance. It's the money going in and the money going out, and how are you dividing the money going out between expenditures and capital, building a capital stock and so on, or just consumption spending. So the savings and investment decisions are critical. I think I just came back from Ghana, as was mentioned, and the transparency that surrounds the Sovereign Wealth Fund there, or the Petroleum Revenue Management Act there, which encompasses both a wealth fund and savings and expenditure decisions, is incredible. It's extremely impressive. There are multiple reports that are issued with detailed numbers by the ministry, by oversight agencies, by the central bank, and so on. But there's still a little bit of worrisome signs that start to develop there as the pressure of failures elsewhere in the macroeconomy starts to make people open up the Petroleum Revenue Management Act and maybe look for possible exceptions. So there are always strains in these things. I think that the real issues with these sovereign wealth funds are going to be governance and the lack of transparency and accountability. And weak institutions. It's not easy to build these institutions up. Some of it's pretty sophisticated finance, and that can lead to expropriations and corruption coming in again. Many of them have politicians who are running the show and politicians on the board, which isn't always a good sign. Then there's confusion over exactly what you want them to do. What are they? Are they extra budgetary structures? Are they supposed to be integrated with the budget? Are they quasi-fiscal institutions, fiscal authorities, and so on? Or are they straight development agencies? right now. The last item, actually.
Okay.
And that's the one that's has been bothering me a lot over the years. It's the national oil companies. Where isn't there a national oil company? Well, actually, there's one country. I don't know if anybody knows, but it's an interesting one. David, you must know.
Which one doesn't have a national? South Africa doesn't have a national.
No, I was thinking of, well, actually, I was thinking of Gabon because they rejected it. They had one and turned it back, but South Africa's true. But there are a lot of them, and some of them are big names that you know very well, and you referred to a couple of them. But Sonangol in Angola, NPC in Nigeria, GMPC now in Ghana. Soundtrack you mentioned too, but that's North Africa. There are real problems with most of these on transparency, and there are real problems because most of them have clouds of corruption, actual corruption charges and corruption rumors surrounding them all the time. They are regarded as an incredibly convenient channel because of all the money they control for ambitious politicians and others who have personal agendas for moving their own personal agendas and so on. Very little transparency. They are a real problem. Laudable in some ways if you can always sell it. Every country starting out gets the right to establish a national oil company put on the books practically. Transfer of technology, managerial skills, and so on. Your former company was always being hit up for, please help us with these sorts of things with our national oil
Chevron.
company. And but there's a lot of non-transparent activity that goes on. So summing up, on the fiscal and financial flows, payments made and revenues received, there's been a very high sign-up on the part of countries that looks very promising, but there is this issue of outputs versus outcomes, sign-ups versus actual developmental impact. And there are some key absentees in Sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, but countries that are key, that, like Uganda, that have not signed up on that. Licensing, again, things are moving in a positive direction, but the outcomes can be disappointing. In Liberia and Nigeria, I'd say they are confusing and disappointing. There have been some surprises. Ghana has some negative surprises. When just before I arrived there were eight new contracts awarded to small companies with no reputation at all on a direct negotiation basis, not on an international competitive bidding. Very surprising. There have been some positive surprises too, by the way. Angola in this one area handles its licensing procedures. 3, contract publication, same story. The direction of movement is positive, and there's a strong international support movement for contract transparency. That may be a good area to watch. 4th, revenue management, the wealth funds and so on. These are very early days, and they're good intentions in most of the countries who put them in place, but they're often confused intentions. It's not entirely clear what they're supposed to be doing, and that can lead to problems. So there's maybe a high risk of abuse. And finally, as I said, the national oil companies, watch them, put the transparency light on them. This is the real potential Achilles heel in the whole transparency story. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. And last but not least, David Goldwyn.
Great, thanks, Jan, and thanks for this continuing series on the book, and to my panelists who've really had a lifetime of service to Africa and to governance and transparency. I think the themes that we struck in the book as they relate to Africa are still true, and they were largely optimistic. The continent is going to grow in size, it's growing in urbanization, it has enormous resources. All the long-term trends for demands for hydrocarbons show that Africa's resources will be strategic and will be important to deliver, and that the potential for Africa to reduce its climate burden and to skip generations of technology and electricity are really quite robust. I think, as you've heard from Charles and from Philip, we've learned an awful lot about how to do resource development right. There are new practices, new organizations, and we've got new government techniques, as you've heard from Michelle, about how to bring financing and creativity to the government. But the question is the one that Charles hit on, which is these are some fantastic outputs, but will the outcomes be different? And I'm going to hawk a little bit of a new study that Jennifer Cook and I did at CSIS. Philip is also quite close to Jennifer Cook. It's on their website. And we started about 1.5 years ago. It was on Africa's new energy producers, and then we kept editing through the low oil price cycle. But essentially it asks the question, will this time be different? Will any of the things that we've learned make life different for the new energy producers to avoid the mistakes of the past? And the answer that we came to is that it's possible, but it's extremely challenging. It's probably more challenging than ever for these new producers before they have the resources in great amounts to apply these lessons and move forward. And there are three big challenges that they face. One is this current low oil price cycle. And as you've heard from Philip, the bottom line is that for the companies who are potential investors in Uganda, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, South Sudan, there are a lot of projects chasing a much smaller number of dollars. And so in order for those projects to be the ones that reach final investment decision, they have to have competitive rates of return, and they have to overcome the challenges of security and lack of infrastructure and that kind of uncertainty, because they're comparing them to the Gulf of Mexico or to the new opening in Mexico or to other places. So that's a big challenge. The second challenge, which you heard about from Philip this morning, is the new character of investor in Africa. And while the big IOCs are still there, there are this new class of smaller and mid-sized companies, the Anadarkos and Tullos and some of the national companies as well. And the good news is that these are companies that basically found hydrocarbons the big companies couldn't and didn't. And so none of these discoveries would have existed without them. But the problem is they tend to be short-term investors. They tend to discover things and hope they're going to get it bought out by somebody else. So they don't really take a long-term view of the investment, and they are a bit more capital constrained. So their ability to invest in the medium term can be problematic. And that leads me to the third challenge, which is this need for shared value, which is the term that I use for a lot of what you heard, which is how does a company show value to the entire country when it invests? And how do you provide enough value so that every succeeding administration that comes to power doesn't want to extract the maximum amount of rent from the project, thereby killing the project? So from the company perspective, they need to do things early on to make themselves valuable to the country, building out telecom, using some of the gas for power, some of the roads, but they need to, even leveraging small and medium-sized enterprises to provide some of the physical services. And that means they need to spend early when they're already in the spending mode and they're not making any money. So for the big companies with a long-term view and reputation, that was hard, but they were starting to get the point of doing that maybe a year and a half ago. Today, that's a much harder bill to sell. And so I think that's a challenge. What countries need to do to have this shared value is to create what I call sustainable bargains. And if you look at Mexico's energy reform, it's a really good example. They have a variable royalty. So when prices are low, the government take is less. When prices go up, the government take is higher. So everybody knows they're in this for the 30-year run and the prices are going to go up and down, but you don't make the project uneconomic early on, because then what will they do? They will walk away. So I think that shared value is important, and also planning for, if you have a gas development, how you're going to spread that across the country. So those are the three big challenges. And so we said, so what should companies and countries and NGOs focus on if they want to change this? And the first one is to build government capacity early. And you've heard this from really all the panelists. And this is a challenge also. Early on, governments need to know how to do licensing, how to have open procurement, how to run auctions, how to have a local content policy, but one that matches their ability to deliver the content so you don't create corruption. As you see in Brazil and other places, where if you have to find a local company, somebody will show up and say, I'm your local company, and here's my cut for just being the local company, not for delivering any value. So this takes creativity, but you're asking countries which don't have a lot of money to invest in building the capacity for regulators and for systems, which they're going to need in 8 years. So that's a tough sell for their government. It's kind of a tough sell for our government if you look at the reform of the Department of Interior. But it also means that donor governments have to start providing these governments with support early on. And a huge amount has been done. The IMF, the World Bank, the Energy and Governance Program I started at the State Department, the ADB. A lot of people are doing this. We need to kind of coordinate this assistance. But if you don't get to the Mozambiques and the Kenyas and the Tanzanias before they have the money, you will never build the systems which are going to prevent corruption. And the corruption doesn't happen in, here's a check because I get this acreage. It comes in how the business is done, and so you have to build these mechanisms. The second thing is to prioritize transparency and accountability, and you've heard from Charles, who spent a lifetime on these issues, on what needs to be done. Petroleum funds, open reporting. But what really has to happen is you have to have the push from external governments, and you have to have the leadership in these countries to say this is a politically successful thing for me to do if I'm the president of a country, and it has to be a priority for U.S. policy, British policy, other donor government policies to help them push this. And on this third issue, which is having governments promote shared value, it really calls on governments to try and think through, if you have a big gas discovery, are we also going to be in the fertilizer business? Are we going to be in the electricity business? Are we going to build a system where people are going to want to invest in other businesses because they know we will have a transparent, accountable, place where you can make money? And in electricity, this is an enormous problem. If you have a country which has high levels of subsidies, so you can't get paid a market rate for the electricity, and the government is going to tell you whether it will or won't pay you a market rate for the gas, then it's going to be very hard, even with competitive financing, for somebody to want to build a power project there, because they're going to make their money off the collections. So that whole complex of talking to governments about frameworks, helping them have that capacity, and having them think through what is the strategic plan for the country when this discovery comes to fruition is really important. Building in a platform so small companies can find the people who are doing the investments. So again, there are great examples of how this work has been done. Mauritania's got the Banda Gas to Power project. It's going to take Mauritanian gas. It's going to bring it to Mali, to Senegal. There are industries that are feeding off that. And so there's lots of help in thinking these things through, but it's easy to lose focus. And when prices are low and hydrocarbons aren't so important, there can be other issues that will command the attention of U.S. policy or the World Bank's policy or other policies, or the governments who have these hydrocarbons can say, well, now we're not going to have this development, or we're going to kick this down the road 5 or 6 years, when instead they could just adapt. And I'll come back to Mexico because they're having a terrifically competitive and successful and transparent reform down there, but they saw this market and they're adapting the terms. And they are making the contract easier to read. They're making the returns a little bit better, but they have the most transparent and accountable system in the world right now. Every dollar that comes into the revenue fund is going to be published. All the contracts are going to be transparent. So it can happen, but it takes an enormous amount of effort. And that leads me to U.S. government policy, because there's nothing I like better as a former U.S. government policymaker than to give unsolicited advice to my colleagues on how they should do their business. And so I think the first priority for U.S. government policy is to channel more of this assistance to this early capacity building, and not to abandon the commitment to this just because oil prices are low. The second is to provide support to the multilateral efforts, the bank and the IMF, and we can provide diplomatic cover to their efforts. And there is a tendency to balkanize these efforts. A third is to support cross-investment, to use the Department of Commerce and others to look at how do you build out the fertilizer or other businesses connected to hydrocarbons, so we don't really consign these governments to being resource cursed. I would say to resume commercial diplomacy. We don't spend a lot of time talking about frameworks and terms and how contracts are done. I mean, Power Africa, we've got this terrific creative approach to embed advisors in those governments. But we can do this diplomatically as well, and I think we could return the Department of Commerce to commercial diplomacy in a way that they haven't had a chance to do in recent years. I think we need to pay more attention to the framework for electricity. It's fine in some of the countries to help work on the financing, but it's getting prices right, and that is the number one issue. And there's probably no better time to cut subsidies and target them than now when prices are low. But that takes a lot of political courage, and that needs external help. And finally, I would say just to maintain our diplomatic support to governance and transparency. The Obama administration has been really phenomenal on this by having the U.S. join EITI. But when prices are low, people tend to shift their focus elsewhere. So bottom line, the next time could be different, but there really are enormous challenges, and it will take a lot of political courage in these countries and from the U.S. to make it happen. And it's good to be optimistic, but it remains to be seen whether we can deliver.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thanks to the entire panel for some excellent presentations, very thought-provoking. I might just ask each of you to reflect on the best case and example of the examples that you've used, and the worst case and example in each of your areas in terms of the investment picture, in terms of the Power Africa picture, in terms of transparency, and whether there is any way to draw some broader lessons from that in terms of development in Africa. I've heard a number of countries cited for doing well. It certainly caught my attention that Angola was doing well on licensing. I didn't think that Angola did well on anything, frankly. But the question there, I guess, for Charles would be, well, if it's doing well in licensing, is there a way for that to be a prompt for doing well in other areas that clearly it's not doing well? Or, is that too facile an approach? So for each of you, please feel free to jump in. Good cases, bad cases.
Okay, I'm going to take an unconventional view on this.
Please do.
I think a very bad example, particularly in a time of retrenchment, of trying to attract investors is what South Africa is doing. South Africa has, potential blocks, potential discoveries offshore. Total got involved in attempting to drill last year, and South Africa, through its regulatory framework, is actually almost chasing investors away. They've tied their hydrocarbons into their mining legislation, which has got a completely different history and a completely different background in terms of who owns the mines down there. And I think that as a result, there's very little going on in South Africa. And I'm going to also give another unusual example for what is a success story, and pick up on what David was saying about, I guess, beneficiation of gas. That probably one of the untold stories that's going on in Nigeria is the extent to which the petrochemical, fertilizer, and I guess secondary kind of sector using natural gas to kind of is actually doing very, very well. And I take several examples. LMA, which is about to become the largest petrochemical factory at Port Harcourt in Africa, producer. Notori, which is providing fertilizer to the farmers in northern Nigeria, which is about to list. So that's I take that because I think that it's not actually looked at as an example of how do you do it. And there's all these dozens of little plastic factories around Port Harcourt that are also kind of beneficiating, taking natural gas and turning it into something that has a secondary value, or has much greater value than just putting it, freezing it, and exporting it.
Thank you. Michelle.
So I'm in the government and I work on Africa, so I'm an optimist. So I'm going to rephrase your question in terms of, let's say, risks and opportunities, and look at a couple examples in Kenya. So we have and we work at the grassroots level. We believe in a bottom-up approach to development at the U.S. African Development Foundation. In Turkana, we're focused on working with herders on livestock marketing, with irrigated agriculture for high-value crops, and with fisheries. Turkana is an area of less than 500,000 people where there hasn't been a lot of development by anyone, internally or externally. And now there's gold, and now there's oil. And so the risk in that area is with the shared value and with everybody participating. So will the Turkana be further behind, or will they actually be able to leverage with some of these resources and gain from it? So again, as an optimist, I see a great deal of possibility there. An example also in Kenya on a very specific scale is with our energy entrepreneurs. And there's three things that they can really benefit from: business capacity, connections, and capital. And the business capacity is that in the same way in some of these government institutions and some of these small and medium-sized local companies and operators, in the renewable sector, you have a great deal of innovation and interest, but there still needs to be the basic small business building blocks. And that's what we are finding with the energy entrepreneurs who we're working with. They need that basic how-to capacity building, how to run their business, how to strategize, how to manage people, for one. For two, they need to feed into networks, because as much as I said, we are seeing a lot of really successful and innovative service providers, there are still some who want to recreate the wheel, and they want their latest and greatest gadget And it's like, you don't need to build it because 5 or 10 other people and companies have, and you should just leverage from what they know. And what do you know? You know your local environment. You know your customer base. You know how to run a business. So use their technologies. And thirdly, there's capital, which is a broken record in terms of access to working capital. ADF provides seed capital. There are different financial instruments within the government, within the international financial institutions, but there's, within the commercial banks, there's not an appetite for risk. So I can dream about further opportunities to reduce this risk and provide more of this bottom-up development with all the possibility with these energy entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Charles. And by the way, I will be asking the audience for questions after we have this round here at the panel.
Well, I think I made clear that there are some very promising signs in Sub-Saharan Africa in the transparency and governance area, but I should perhaps say as background that we've got a long way to go still, because most of the countries that we're talking about are scoring very poorly, like in the bottom third of the league tables in Transparency International's listings, and not doing well on the Natural Resource Government Institute's Resource Government Index. So there is a long way to go. But there are some good examples. One I think was that I mentioned, though I saw some problems, was Ghana. They've a good EITI track record. They've started the right way in licensing, with the exception of the blip that happened at the end of last year. Their contracts are public now, and what they're doing with the Petroleum Revenue Management Act really is a great example of transparency and civil society oversight. They actually have encouraged now and have a very active civil society that produces some of the best reports I've seen in terms of insightful criticisms of what the government's doing. And they are not putting those people in jail. Those people are out there creating a lot of trouble for some of the people in the administration, but doing a good job. What worst examples? Philip, you quoted some good things that are happening in Nigeria, and I know there are good things happening in Nigeria. And I wouldn't say Nigeria is the worst example necessarily either, except that with all the potential it has and all the good initiatives they've tried to launch, it's very disappointing. The corruption continues to be rampant in Nigeria in many areas, and a lot of it goes right back to the oil sector. And NMPC very definitely is part of that. Caught up with the coming elections, and it's been caught up in everything that's been has put a cloud on Nigeria's reputation. So that I think that's the disappointing example.
Thank you.
Couldn't agree more with Charles. I would say I'd give on the positive side, a shout out to the IFC's oil linkages program, which helps link SMEs to countries. And I think Anadarko and has a relationship with this Pixera company in Mozambique, which is a good example of how it can bring SMEs into the process. On the negative side, I would have to call out Tanzania and Mozambique, who are both talking now about new terms, adverse than what they had before, wanting 25% of all the gas that's produced to be used for domestic purposes, which is probably more than they need. So they are actually making the terms worse just at the time when they are in a less competitive position. So I think for Mozambique, the resource is big. It will lead to some delay. In Tanzania, they could put this off years if they do this. So it's really moving swiftly in the wrong direction.
Thank you. Okay, well, I see a number of hands raised, quite a few hands raised. So let's start with, and please identify yourself before you ask the question. We have the mics coming over here.
Hi, I'm Tony Carroll with Manchester Trade. Maybe Charles or David, what is the impact of a declining sales to the United States from a country like Nigeria? Within the last 7 or 8 years, Nigeria has gone from being a large supplier to the U.S. to being no supplier to the U.S. In fact, I think Nigeria actually imports fuels from the United States, specialty fuels, so that they've got to run a negative balance with the United States in terms. What is the long-term impact of that? Lack of a reliable market, lack of traction of major operators. I don't know. I don't know enough in the industry to know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because it's basically a fungible commodity. But if you're not selling to what is the largest market, what does that mean for the long-term stability of those producers?
Do you want to take more than one at a time, or?
Yes, why don't we take one more, and over here, the lady right here.
Good morning. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm a president of a non-profit organization called Hope for Tomorrow and a company called Segueros International Group. I'm from Kenya and I'm based here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, and Michelle, thank you for supporting Turkana. When Turkana was awarded the irrigation money, I was here. Nobody thought of Turkana was a place where people could go. So I focus on renewable in Western Kenya, Kakamega, where I come from, working with small and medium businesses in renewable. How do we work with you on this? Because we're trying to submit out proposals, talk to the power, is all the big guys out there talking about Power Africa, and we are women talking about how do women get access to power in the rural areas, rural industrialization. You know, you need to work with people like us. So how do we collaborate, and how do we get funding from African Foundation to make this happen, especially in the rural industrialization and women, and even schools and those small businesses you're talking about being in renewables? Thank you.
And I will take one more question so that we can, yes, all the way in the back. Yes.
Thank you, Jan. It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. I wonder if I could get a quick assessment from everyone on the panel. Maybe Michelle, if you don't want to, that's fine. But on Power Africa, what has it delivered, and how can it be improved to be even more effective?
Well, that's a great mix. So shall we start with Nigeria and then go on to the power questions?
You want? All right. Let me take a run at Nigeria first. I mean, I think from I think it does a couple of things. I think U.S. interests in Nigeria, because they go beyond hydrocarbons, are not eroded by the fact that we don't import them from them anymore. And in fact, I think it frees our hand a little bit to talk about some of the internal structure and development, because it's not about us. It's sort of similar to other countries we don't import from. So it gives us a little bit freer moral hand, and I think we'll still be interested. It does open the door to other players in Nigeria. So even though U.S. will have an interest in protecting U.S. investment, and I think European investment is still larger than U.S. investment in Sub-Saharan Africa, you may have other players, and the transition internally to domestic players gives us less traction on the onshore issues, because the U.S. isn't present there. But I think our commitment remains strong. And I would say, just with respect to the Power Africa question, Dana's question, I think the main thing that we need to do is address the framework, getting prices right in these countries. It's going to be very hard for Power Africa to succeed, or anybody else to succeed, if you don't target subsidies and get industrial players, government players, wealthy people to pay a market rate for electricity. You're not going to have it's a small market to begin with. You probably won't have enough there, and then you're going to have to aggregate those markets to have serious investment.
Okay, Charles?
I certainly hope we can pass this over to you too, Philip, because but on Nigeria, But I just want to add one thing. You mentioned the now importing products, petroleum products. That's been going on for some time, and I'm not going to beat this horse any longer, but a lot of it can be traced back to the behavior of NMPC, because those refineries, it's a national disgrace. Nigeria should be a major product export hub for refined products, and because the refineries don't work, and because there's been massive corruption in relation to running the refineries, because big men have been given an incentive to make certain that the refineries don't work, because they get the import contracts, they don't work. And so it's just another illustration of the disappointment related to some parts in Nigeria.
Power Africa, you want to say?
No, I'm sorry.
You're going to pass. All right. And Philip, and then we're going to give Michelle a chance.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Just on Nigeria.
I mean, just on Nigeria and oil, the fact that oil is not sold government to government. The more important thing is where are the cargoes going that the traders are moving. It's Trafigura, Vitol, etc. And they find other markets. I mean, as you say, oil is a fungible commodity. There are other places. China is buying more Nigerian oil, though it's not exactly, the Bonny crude light is not exactly what they use in their refineries. China tends to buy from Angola and South Sudan. But there's certainly no indication that Nigerian oil is not finding a market any more than anybody else who produces oil, puts it on a tanker. There are buyers. So, it more affects the perception as to whether or not the United States, what does that give them, more leverage or less leverage? And I tend to agree with David that it frees America up from the sense of being, you're just here for our oil, to being actually a more honest sort of player in the country.
Okay, and over to you, Michelle. There are a couple of questions there. Do you want to do a self-assessment?
Remember, I'm positive here, and these problems, of course, haven't grown up overnight. We've had Nigerian oil for how many decades, and we have some of our best energy entrepreneurs all across Nigeria working on biofuels, working on solar, basically small refrigeration units for smallholder farmers so that they can reduce post-harvest loss. So the ideas are out there, and ideally with what my colleagues have talked about, both the top-down, the big picture, the institutional reforms, as well as the bottom-up and the financial and transaction work that Power Africa has helped leveraging, and the attention we're bringing to it, I think the landscape will look very different in a few years from now. And it already is with particular deals. When it comes to better involving women, it's not just USADF and involving villagers. OPIC is doing work as well as AID in Tanzania, in Rwanda, and we know that we need to work on the community level to get buy-in. So it isn't simply what I was focusing on with the SMEs who have the small and medium-sized enterprises, but also intentionally working with the community so they understand, why am I doing this? Why am I trying this? And do I know that you're going to come and maintain this system? So I'm happy to talk with you afterwards.
Great, thank you. We have 5 more minutes, so I will take a few questions, and I apologize to those who we haven't had time. All the way in the back for the first question, please identify yourself, and the mic is coming your way.
Hello, my name is Joyce Rogers Holiday. I'm the Executive Director of the International Association of African NGOs. My question, I guess, is to Charles. To what extent is U.S. fund and aid and investments contingent upon good governance and social accountability on the continent? Because basically, lack of social accountability and good governance is why the continent is crippling with corruption. I'm from Nigeria, and you talked about the contracts. A lot of times, sometimes they're transparent, but however, behind the scenes, the contracts are given already. They already know who they're going to give the contracts to. They decide upon themselves, and they pass on these contracts to family members, and then you get this listing, on the internet. Oh, these contracts are available, but they're not available. You have the public bidding for these contracts, but the government, the political figures already know who. They get their friends and their relatives to fund for them. And I'm thinking if you have any information on how other countries are dealing with this. And also with...
yes, we'll have to make it fairly short.
Okay. With Dave, you talked about shared value. There needs to be a mindset change in the continent. There's just this sense of entitlement that the government is responsible for everything, even with the private sector and the citizens themselves. So we need to, there needs to be some kind of education going on the continent to change the mindset of the people, to understand that everyone has a stake in it and everyone has a contribution to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll ask everyone to try to keep their questions short so as to accommodate a few more. Over here, please. Again, please identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Yosef Berhe from Ethiopian Press Group. My question is for Charles. You mentioned the contracts and transparency. I don't think so. There is no transparency, especially when you see South Sudan, Uganda, even Ethiopia and Power Africa. First of all, on the Chinese side, there's no, the Chinese, they don't want to see any contracts. They don't want to put any contracts in the front. And the African governments, they don't want to put any contract in the front. On both sides, they don't want to put the contract, and they don't want to transparency. So where does the transparency come from?
Okay.
On the
I have
Port
a
Africa,
question.
okay,
Yes.
on the Port Africa, now everybody's lining up for the project for the 7 billion. Like maybe 100 or 200 small companies. Some companies just pop up, and everybody's lining
So
up
what's your question, please?
for Port Africa, and there's no transparency. We don't know how many companies in Africa, and we don't know how many projects. And for most Africans, they don't know what's Port Africa, and where does the money come from,
Okay,
and what to do.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure people are accommodated. And let's see, over here. Yes.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent are things being done with meetings over the internet of getting together groups of people and getting their funding together and getting that transparency?
Okay, thank you. And in the middle there, the gentleman right there, yes?
I thank you. Herb Howe, Georgetown University. Question related partly to Nigeria, but expands outward. And that is, Nigeria claims to have a more accountable system and a democratizing system. But the Nigerian military has certainly colluded in the bunkering of at least 100,000 barrels a day. Economists last week, I think, put up at 400,000. What lessons are there that might come out of this Nigerian experience that other countries can use in their civil-military relations?
Thank you. And one final one from Arlo Cohen here in front. We're giving you a grab back.
R.L. Cohen, International Market Analysis. A question to David, but to others as well. In the current $50 to $60 a barrel range, how does it affect the pace of development, both oil and gas, both onshore and offshore? I understand the geographical differences. If we shift down to 30 to 40, how is that going to affect it? Thank you. Or rather 30 to 50. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll go straight around and hopefully be able to do this in a few minutes.
Well, I think with respect to the price cycle, while you won't see very much new exploration and production, I think probably this year, most of these companies take the long view. And I think the division that Philip talked about is probably the right one. I think for the world-class size resources, which you see in Mozambique and Tanzania, those will go forward, but probably on a slower pace. I think for the marginal areas, which are unfortunately turning out to be Sierra Leone, Liberia for two, maybe Cote d'Ivoire for another one, those will go slower and may get sold off to other players, and things like Uganda will depend on whether they can build a pipeline. So I think it may slow things, but these companies take a 30-year view, so I think the large resources will probably move. And on the sort of lessons learned about civil and military relationships, I mean, it's it's always a hard policy question whether you engage in problematic governments or wait for them to change. I have been a believer that you engage with them, and you engage with them on different issues. So we don't supply equipment to the Nigerian military. We try to get them to cooperate on things where we think it's constructive, and we tell them what we think about what they're doing when they're doing things wrong. On the corruption issues, we call the Nigerian government on corruption, probably on a weekly basis, but we also fund efforts to try and increase transparency. So and you can put Uganda in the same category. Try and build transparent systems, but call them out on human rights as well. And that's just the complex business of diplomacy, as many of my colleagues here in the room could tell you better than me.
Charles.
These are some very tough questions and very good questions. On the what do IFIs, what do governments do, saying with David's point about corruption and lack of transparency and so on, I think for the large international institutions like the ones I was associated with, and from what David is saying, it's also true for the U.S. government, you can't hit an on-off switch when there's lack of transparency in a country or egregious instances of corruption. You have other things that make up your country relationship, and so sometimes you have to spend more time on those, and you sort of turn down the level of commitment to the country if things are going badly. But you can't simply turn it off. It's not easy for that to happen at that level. I do think the encouraging sign is your own activity. NGOs seem to be getting far more informed, more intelligent about what's in these contracts and what goes on and what it means to have a proper licensing program and so on, and are getting much more aggressive and have much higher profile, and that's all to the good. And those are being supported and promoted by the institutions and by bilateral relationships. You said it was complicated, David. It is complicated. One famous picture I remember showed Theodore Obiang from Equatorial Guinea, who's not high on any governance list, that country, being welcomed to the White House. But they're a large oil producer. So it does take two to tango. The commitment has to come from the country that is directly involved, but it also has to come on a bilateral basis from those of us who belong to countries that are dealing with these regimes. On the point you're making about lack of transparency, governments don't want it and companies don't want it. I mean, you mentioned two countries, South Sudan and Uganda. I'll just say my Uganda story that was I've held off on, but that was very interesting because Uganda's promoting a lot of transparency in many other areas, doing a lot of very good things, licensing that's coming up and so on, their revenue management law. But they said no to EITI, and they said no to publication of contracts. What actually happened there is that opposition party people got hold of parts of a contract and published them and made got a great deal of mileage in criticizing the government out of misrepresenting some of the parts of the contract. And it led to some violent conflicts. So the government said, that's it, we're not putting these out in the public domain. It's causing too much trouble. In fact, I would have said that what should have been done is to get people who had credibility in commenting on what a good contract looks like to come in and say, this is what this contract has and this is good practice, instead of shutting the door on public dialogue.
Thank you. Running out of time, but please.
Sure, and very briefly, I'll just say that Power Africa is echoing what David had referred to, that we're engaging with different countries in different ways. So within the swath of the policy work, the large transactions, and a focus on beyond the grid, really it depends on the operating environment and the appetite of the host country government, as well as the private sector interest in terms of what we are providing.
I just want to tackle Herb's question about the military. I mean, the military are part of a whole system. I mean, they don't sort of go and bunker the oil on their own. They are paying people higher up. So that level of illegality, if you like, goes right up to some of the higher echelons in government, and is not really a specifically military civil question, but rather a question of how do you deal with organized crime when it basically manifests itself in the state. And I think that's a much deeper question that I can't go into here, but it certainly is one that has to be tackled, and that's the lesson of Nigeria, that a lot of that illegality down in the Delta creates a chain of organized crime all the way up and down in the system. And I just want to deal very briefly with NNPC, because that's come up several times. I think one or two things got thrown at me there. The Petroleum Industry Bill, endlessly delayed, now sitting in the National Assembly. Essentially, the kernel of the idea behind the Petroleum Industry Bill in Nigeria is to separate out the regulatory functions of the NNPC from the fact that the NNPC is a major stakeholder in a lot of the blocks, and in fact an operating company in Nigeria. So you take, in fact, in many ways, Sonangol is that, though Sonangol retains a regulatory function. The best way, I think, to deal with it is you take the NNPC, you create that commercial NNPC, and then you take it to the market. You take it to, you try and do an IPO. So you've got to clean yourself up. And the reason why I say that is because the small Nigerian indigenous companies, many of whom have skeletons in the closet, had to come through that process as well. And they've had to list. And once you go to the capital markets and you've got to present yourself, to London Stock Exchange, Toronto, even Johannesburg, wherever you go, you've got to clean up your act if you want to get capital in. And I think letting the market do that is actually a pretty effective way of starting to clean up. And I think that's the answer to the NNPC's travail, frankly.
Well, that is a challenging conclusion to an excellent panel, and I will look forward to the NNPC listing in London. That will be really something. So thank you very much to our panelists for an excellent discussion.
That was a big part of the bill.
We have all sorts of fixes, huh?
Really